Every night, she becomes more human.
From deserts to cities, from secrets to love, every border hides a story.
The wedding photograph arrived 3 weeks before James ever met his bride. His mother slid the glossy print across the coffee table in their sole apartment, her hands trembling with an excitement that made James's stomach turn. In the photo, a young woman in traditional hanbok stared back at him. Her name was Min Ji, his mother explained, and she came from a good family in Busan. The marriage broker had arranged everything. She was perfect for him, his mother insisted, her Korean rapid-fire and urgent. 26 years old, never married, from a respectable family. Her father owned a fish market near Jagalchi. James picked up the photograph, studying the pale face framed by the crimson and gold wedding hanbok. Something about Minji's expression unsettled him. Not quite a smile, not quite resignation. Just emptiness. He asked why she looked so sad, his imperfect Korean stumbling over the words. His mother snatched the photo back. She was being traditional, she said, proper. Not like these modern girls who showed their teeth in every picture. James had moved to Korea 6 months earlier to teach English, reconnecting with his mother's homeland after growing up in California. She'd immediately begun her campaign to find him a wife, convinced that at 32, he was dangerously close to becoming unmarriageable. In Korea, she reminded him constantly, family expectations weren't optional, they were destiny. The traditional matchmaking process had felt archaic to James, but his mother's determination wore him down like water on stone. She'd enlisted the help of a marriage broker, a stern woman named Mrs. Pak, who claimed to have facilitated over 300 successful unions. When Mrs. Pak presented Minji's profile, his mother had wept with relief. The wedding was in 2 weeks, his mother announced. Everything was arranged. 2 weeks, James protested. He hadn't even met her. He would meet her at the piebag ceremony, his mother said firmly. This was how it was done properly, with respect for tradition. But tradition, James would soon learn, sometimes carried darker obligations than respect. The first sign that something was wrong came from Minji's family. James traveled to Busan alone. His mother claimed illness, though he suspected she simply wanted him to handle this himself, to prove his commitment. The address Mrs. Pak provided led him to a neighborhood near the sea, where narrow houses pressed against each other like commuters on a subway. Salt air and fish guts perfumed every breath. He found the house number and knocked. The door opened immediately, as if someone had been waiting on the other side. An elderly woman stood in the threshold, dressed entirely in white, the traditional color of mourning. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunken and red-rimmed. Behind her, James glimpsed a house draped in white cloth, with photographs covering every surface. She told him he must be James, her voice flat as dead water. She was Minji's mother. James bowed deeply, saying it was an honor to meet her, that he was looking forward to meeting Minji. The woman's face crumpled. She pressed a hand to her mouth, and for a moment James thought she might collapse. Then she steadied herself, gripping the doorframe. She told him to come in, her voice barely a whisper. There was something he needed to know. The interior of the house was a shrine. Photographs of Minji covered every wall. Minji as a child. Minji in school uniform, Minji in that same red hanbok from the wedding photo. White funeral banners hung from the ceiling, and in the center of the main room sat an altar laden with fruit, rice cakes, and burning incense. Above the altar hung a portrait of Minji draped in black ribbons. Mrs. Lee's voice became mechanical, rehearsed, as she explained that her daughter had died 8 months ago. Minji had drowned herself in the sea. The shame had been too much for her to bear. James felt the floor tilt beneath him. He asked why they were having a wedding, what any of this meant. It was a ghost wedding, Minji's father said, emerging from the shadows. He was a thick man, with hands scarred from years of handling fish. James was going to marry his daughter's spirit. The room spun. James backed toward the door, but Minji's father moved to block his path. His mother had already accepted the yemul, the marriage gifts, the father explained. She had taken their money. The contract was binding. James said this was insane. His mother would never do such a thing. Mrs. Lee interrupted, her voice suddenly sharp. His mother had needed the money, her gambling debts. Mrs. Park had told them everything. They had made a generous offer, and his mother had accepted. In Korean tradition, a daughter who died unmarried brought shame to her family. Her spirit wandered, restless and angry. But if they married her properly, she could rest. James's mind reeled. Ghost marriages, Minghun in Chinese culture, Mudon in some Korean traditions. He'd read about them in grad school, ancient practices meant to appease spirits and satisfy family honor. But those were historical curiosities, not something that happened in modern Korea. He said he wouldn't do it, pushing past Mr. Lee toward the door. Mrs. Lee's voice followed him like smoke. His mother had signed papers, legal documents. If he refused, they would sue her for breach of contract and emotional damages. She would lose everything. James froze with his hand on the door handle. Mr. Lee's voice became soft, almost gentle. He told James to think about it. It was just one ceremony. One day. He would dress in traditional clothes. They would perform the pieback. He would bow to Minji's tablet, and it would be done. He would never have to come back. But Minji's spirit would be at peace, their family honor would be restored, and his mother wouldn't be destroyed. The debt James called his mother 17 times. She didn't answer. He finally found her at a Buddhist temple in Insadong, kneeling before a golden Buddha with her hands pressed together so tightly her knuckles had gone white. When she saw him, she didn't rise. She didn't apologize. She simply looked at him with eyes full of desperate shame. James asked how much she owed, his voice hollow. 60 million won, she said, maybe 70. She had lost count. Nearly $50,000. James felt sick. The Lee family had offered 100 million won, she continued, enough to pay everything and start fresh. They had been desperate, their daughter's spirit. They said she appeared to them at night, dripping with seawater, begging to be properly married. And Mrs. Park had said James would never find out the truth until after the ceremony. James said she had sold him to ghosts, the words bitter on his tongue. She had sold him to tradition, his mother cried out, her voice cracking. This was how things worked here. Family obligations came first. Minji needed peace, her parents needed closure, she needed survival. And James, he just needed to stand there for one ceremony and bow. He asked what happened after. Was he married to a dead woman forever? The marriage would dissolve after 1 year, she explained. Korean law still recognized some traditional practices in family matters. The Lee family's lawyer had explained everything. 1 year, and he would be free. He wouldn't even have to use her name. James looked at his mother, really looked at her, and saw a stranger. Or perhaps he saw Korea itself, the weight of 5,000 years of tradition pressing down on individual lives, crushing personal will beneath collective obligation. He told her slowly, deliberately, that if he did this, they were finished. She needed to understand that. She nodded, tears streaming down her face, but she didn't argue. She knew she had already lost him. The days before the wedding passed in a blur of shame and anger. James tried to find a way out, consulted with lawyers, searched for loopholes, but his mother had signed everything. The contract was ironclad, mixing traditional Korean family law with modern legal language in a way that made it nearly impossible to break without destroying his mother financially. The Lee family called him twice. Each time, Mrs. Lee's voice carried that same mechanical quality, as if she were reading from a script written by grief itself. She told him about Minji, how she had been engaged to a young man from Seoul, how he had broken off the engagement when he discovered she couldn't have children. How the shame had consumed her until the sea seemed like the only escape. In Korean culture, Mrs. Lee explained, an unmarried daughter who died brought misfortune to the entire family. Her spirit couldn't enter the afterlife properly. She was trapped between worlds, angry and restless. The family had consulted shamans, Buddhist monks, even a Catholic priest. Everyone had said the same thing. Minji needed to be married. James wanted to hang up, to block their numbers, to run. But every time he thought about his mother sitting in prison for unpaid gambling debts, every time he imagined her shame when the community discovered what she had done, he stayed on the line and listened. Mr. Lee called on the last night before the ceremony. His voice was different from his wife's, rougher, more pragmatic. He told James that he understood this was difficult. that he knew how it must seem to someone raised in America. But in Korea, duty to family transcended personal comfort. Minji had died fulfilling her duty. She had removed herself rather than continue to shame them. Now it was James's turn to fulfill his duty to his mother. The logic was twisted, cruel, but James couldn't argue with it. He had been raised in California, but his mother had ensured he understood Korean values. Filial piety wasn't just respect. It was obligation, sacrifice, sometimes even suffering. Children owed their parents everything. And debts in Korean culture weren't just financial. They were moral, spiritual, eternal. The wedding took place on a grey morning when fog rolled off the sea like gravecloth. They held the ceremony in the Lee family home, transformed into a temporary shrine. Buddhist monks chanted sutras while shamans beat drums to cool Minji's spirit. James stood in rented traditional hanbok, feeling like an actor in someone else's nightmare. Where a bride should have stood, there was only a wooden tablet bearing Minji's name and death date. Beside it, a mannequin dressed in a wedding hanbok held a portrait of her face. James's hands shook as he performed the traditional bows, once to heaven and earth, once to Minji's parents, once to Minji's tablet. The shamans chanted louder and someone threw rice. It felt like drowning. But the worst part came during the pieback, the ceremony where the bride and groom shared ritual food and wine. The shaman pressed a cup of rice wine to the portrait's painted lips, then turned it and pressed the same spot to James's mouth. He tasted lipstick and something else, salt and seaweed, cold and wet. The shaman announced that Minji accepted him, and Mrs. Lee began to sob. The ceremony ended with the signing of papers, official documents that recognized the marriage under traditional Korean family law. James's hand cramped as he wrote his name next to Minji's. His mother stood in the corner, unable to meet his eyes, her face grey with shame and relief. The Lee family served a traditional wedding feast, though James could barely eat. The food tasted like ashes. Around him, relatives who had known Minji alive spoke about her in hushed tones, as if afraid she might hear and be offended. They thanked James repeatedly, bowing deeply, telling him he had done a great service, that he had shown true Korean virtue. James left as soon as he could, catching the last train back to Seoul. His mother tried to follow him, but he told her not to, his voice flat and empty. She needed to stay and receive the money, to settle her debts, to finish what she had started. He would go home alone. That night, alone in his apartment, James woke to the sound of dripping water. At first he thought a pipe had burst. Then he saw her. Minji stood at the foot of his bed, still wearing her red wedding hanbok. Water pooled beneath her feet, and her hair hung in wet ropes around a face that was simultaneously the one from the photograph and something else. Something blue-lipped and bloated, with eyes like drowned moons. James couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She tilted her head, studying him with an expression he couldn't read. Then she spoke, her voice the sound of waves pulling back from shore. She thanked him. Gomawoyo. She smiled, a real smile this time, not the empty expression from the photograph, and as she did, her features shifted. The bloating faded, color returned to her lips. She looked almost alive, almost happy. She told him she could rest now. The shame was lifted. Her parents could sleep. And James, she paused, water still dripping from her hair. He could be free. 1 year. Then they both would be. She bowed deeply, the gesture of a bride to her husband, and faded like mist burning off the sea. Over the following months, Minji appeared 3 more times. Each visit, she looked less like a drowned ghost and more like the woman from the photograph. Peaceful, resolved, ready to move forward. She never said much, just stood at the foot of his bed or in the corner of his kitchen, watching him with those dark eyes that had once seemed so empty. James tried to continue his life as if nothing had changed. He taught his English classes, went out drinking with co-workers, even went on a few dates with a Canadian teacher at his school. But the dates never went anywhere. How could he explain that he was married to a ghost? How could he tell anyone that sometimes he woke to find seawater on his floor and a dead woman in his room? His mother called occasionally, but James never answered. She left voicemails apologizing, explaining, justifying. The Lee family had released her from the debt, she said. She had a small apartment now, had found work at a convenience store. She wanted to see him, to explain everything properly. But James deleted the messages without listening to them all the way through. The isolation ate at him. He realized, slowly, that the ghost marriage had done more than bind him to Minji's spirit. It had bound him to Korea itself, to all the traditions and obligations and cultural weights he had spent his life trying to avoid. He was trapped not by supernatural forces, but by duty, by shame, by the invisible chains that connected parents and children across generations. Oh.